Okay, great. I'm just going to take a minute to just share my screen.
And please introduce yourselves if you can.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Can everyone see my screen? Okay, great. Thank you. So yeah, thank you so much for carving out some time in your agenda for us to talk about a policy that we think is really important and we think can help keep people housed here in Eugene. My name is Ellen McCain. I am a third-year law student at the University of Oregon, and I also serve on the board of directors of the Springfield Eugene Tenant Association. And I'll let my colleague Kevin go ahead and introduce himself real quick.
Hi, everyone. Kevin Cronin here. He, him pronouns. I'm the Director of Member Relations and Industry Support for Housing Oregon, which is our trade association of nonprofit housing developers.
Great. So today we're going to be talking about displacement prevention assistance. I'm going to call it DPA for short. And I'm going to kick us off and just give some context about what this policy is and kind of what's happened on this issue in Portland. Then I'll hand it over to Kevin, and he's going to talk about opportunities here in Eugene on this policy space. Okay, so what is DPA? So the core goal of DPA is to provide tenants with financial support when they're pushed out of their unit through no fault of their own. So we know when folks are unexpectedly forced to move, it can be really devastating to their finances, and it can also increase the likelihood that they become homeless. So if we connect them with financial support at the point they're being forced to move out, we increase the likelihood that they're able to relocate in a timely manner. So at a really high level, how this would work is a landlord would be required to pay 3 months rent to a tenant under two circumstances. One, they've issued a no cause eviction notice, or secondly, the landlord issues a rent increase that the tenant causes the tenant to no longer be able to afford the unit, and the tenant actually decides to vacate the unit. And the kind of underlying rationale here is that, the decision to issue these types of notices are often influenced by market factors and business calculations. And so it's an upstream solution that, minimizes cost to the city by allocating that cost to, the person or entity who stands to profit. So as you can see, DPA has amassed a broad base of support here locally. I won't read off every single bullet on this slide, but we, as you can see, have got a variety of different community groups, including the NAACP, various labor chapters, and some local political organizations. Okay, so in 2017, Portland adopted a very similar policy. They call it RELO for short, and it works very similarly to what I just stated previously. So the tenant is entitled to relocation assistance when they get a no cause eviction, or secondly, if they get a rent increase of 10% or more, and the tenant requests relocation assistance in writing. So when they get that assistance, they then have 6 months to either move out or to return that assistance to the landlord. In Portland, the way they did it is they developed like a fixed schedule for the amount of that assistance based on the unit size. So that's what you see up on the slide here. There's a different kind of fixed amount for a studio, 1, 2, 3 bedroom plus. And then we just wanted to really kind of briefly mention that after Portland's RELO was passed, it was challenged in court. It was litigated up through the Supreme Court, which late last year upheld the ordinance and said it was consistent with state rent control law. And kind of like two really broad key takeaways. The court said cities have the authority to pass measures that are trying to prevent displacement of their residents, and it's okay if those measures have some influence on the rent a landlord decides to charge. And in that vein, they really kind of looked at this as not a penalty, but just a procedural requirement that's attached to that decision. So with that, I'll hand it over to Kevin.
So in November 2021, the City Council had a work session where they asked for this policy to be included in the renter protections being under consideration. This policy in particular did not make it through the Housing Policy Board, and it sort of came as an after the fact. But in Eugene's March 16th work session, we got some critical feedback from City Council. So Council believes that this policy is important However, they don't want to pass a carbon copy of the Portland measure, and they want to tailor this policy to fit Eugene. So accordingly, council voted 5-3 against moving DPA from phase 2 to phase 1. And as we learned earlier, phase 1 is set for a vote or an action in July, as well as a hearing coming up June 21st. And additionally, council set a deadline for phase 2 protections to return to the city for a work session no later than November 1st of this year. So this brings up how do we want to tailor this policy to fit Eugene's needs? So there's 3 main questions that we want to sort of get some feedback on and some input, and these are the different levers that we can use to sort of tailor this policy. So what is an appropriate rent increase threshold to trigger displacement prevention assistance? What is an appropriate DPA payment per bedroom size? And then does Eugene want to have a small landlord compensation fund? Okay, so for the rent increase trigger part, this is the part that I believe received most of the attention in Owens versus City of Portland. So this part we want to be extra mindful of. There has been 4 different proposals for the rent increase trigger to be decided upon. So the first one will be Portland's threshold of 10%. And because the state has a rent control measure in place that is about 10%, it adjusts year per year. This provision primarily affects those that live in new construction that are exempt from that statewide rent control. So that's Portland's threshold is 10%. The lower threshold, OHCS at I believe their May Housing Stability Council meeting passed a new rent increase policy that's 5%, and it sort of picking a threshold of 5% would line up well with that policy, and that would sort of make it so that any multifamily or tax credit units wouldn't be affected by this policy unless they were going through, say, a 15-year exit or a 30-year exit or some major refinancing where they would have to get permission from OHCS. And so my understanding is they would have extra compliance support to make sure that they could comply with this policy. The third one is Social Security Cost of Living Increase Index. We know that renters whose primary source of income is Social Security or Social Security disability, that those people who receive that as their primary source of income, they're almost exclusively renters. You'll find maybe 2 or 3 citywide that would own their own property, but really that's their sole source of income. And even with a voucher, rents are becoming increasingly unaffordable for them. And so tying it to this index would be one option that we can consider that would really demonstrate the city council's commitment to seniors and people with disabilities. However, it is my opinion that this would carry an increased risk of litigation based on the history of Social Security cost of living adjustments. And then the final one is twice the Consumer Price Index. This is what advocates first brought to the city into the discussion, and this would be twice the CPI Western Region Price Index, which is published monthly by the Department of Labor. So other things that should be included with the rent increase provision is that valid rent increases in the city of Eugene should include language about DPA, letting tenants know about their rights to this. And then in order to trigger a DPA payment for a rent increase, tenants must request DPA in writing to their landlord to get it. So that way landlords and tenants are on the same page about what is going on with a rent increase. Landlords are also able to rescind their rent increase and maybe come back with a different amount later if they don't like it. So can we go to the next slide, please? The next big lever is the DPA payment amount. So Portland decided to set a fixed amount per their city code, which I think is it doesn't really keep that long-term affordability of the goal of this policy is to for someone being displaced to be able to find a comparable unit on short notice. So we could go with a set schedule. The second one is, I believe some city councilors discussed it in the work session, was 3 times the current contract rent. So previously I had a role at Homes for Good, and one of my tenants was renting a ADU from someone, and their rent was about $400 a month. Their landlord passed away. The house went on the market. They were issued a no-cause notice. And so because they were paying such below market rental rates, they would have the DPA payment in this case would be $1,200. And we know that $1,200 is not going to make the cut for someone to pay first, last, and security deposit to get into their next spot. So this can really affect people differently depending on what their current rent is at. And so it's something that we need to consider if the city wants to move forward with this. The next option, which I think is probably the fairest option, is that we would base DPA payments based on the current fair market rents. So fair market rents are published by HUD. They have a great little tool where you can select your statistical area, and we pull it up, Lane County, and currently the fair market rents for Lane County, 1 bedroom is $958, a 2 bedroom is $1,254. These are created by, you know, kind of a complicated formula, but they're all based off of a 2019 study commissioned by Homes for Good, and I believe Washington State University conducted it. So my recommendation is to set the DPA payment amount to 3 times the fair market rent. Can we go to the next slide, please? Small landlord compensation fund. So in talking with advocates in Portland, one of the things that they said, if they could wave their magic wand and change anything about the policy for Portland, would be to create a small landlord compensation fund. And this would be a city fund that certain qualified landlords could apply for subsidy for hardship reasons. Landlords would need to demonstrate that hardship, and certain no cause reasons and rent increases would be ineligible for funding. So we're talking about no cause where the property is being sold. We're talking about no cause where someone is doing major renovations on the unit to upgrade the unit so that they can charge more rent. We're talking about those type, or a rent increase, because those decisions directly lead to profit. Things that would be eligible would be, say, a family member moving in, or, you know, a landlord returning to their only unit. Those would be types where a hardship would be eligible for funding. So what is a small landlord? Some people say that a small landlord is someone with 1 unit or less. For the purposes of the state, they said 4 units or less in regards to no cause evictions. So my recommendation is that we consider a small landlord to be any landlord with 4 or fewer rentals. How is the small landlord compensation fee funded? My proposal would say that it's funded by Eugene's per door fee. And then how does one apply? Someone would submit an application. It would be reviewed and voted on by the Housing Policy Board. That is my proposal for the small landlord compensation fund. A lot of thought has gone into DPA. And so, you know, the purpose of this presentation is to, you know, start the conversation. We really need to think carefully about what we want our policy to look like in Eugene. And we want to balance that against litigation risk. And we want something that is going to help people stay housed. It looks like Bernice has a question.
Okay, thank you. I was wondering, so with these funds, what if they don't find a house right away? What if they're, end up homeless for a while and they're still looking? How do they still, how long can they access that money? Is there a place to keep it for them until they find a place, or, just wondering about that.
So in Portland, how it works is that when someone is issued a valid no cause notice, they are sent the payment by the landlord. And so it's in the tenant's possession the whole time.
Okay,
Yep. Even if they don't find housing.
a place, yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Julia. Thanks, Bernice.
Oh, yes. Okay. So I have just a couple of things I wanted to say. First, I just wanted to remind people who might not have been here in the process that the reasons why DPA didn't go through the Renter Protections Committee and come forward with those other provisions was entirely historical. We became aware of this as a possibility quite late in our process, and it was clear that it would delay moving the renter protections as a body forward. So the committee thought it was a good idea, but it wasn't part of our formal thing. So then I wanted to specifically talk about the small landlord compensation, and possibly this would be asking a question. There's quite a high percentage of small landlords in Eugene, and based on conversations I've had with landlords, including a talk I gave at the City Club, small landlords are using no cause evictions fairly heavily, and they use them because they do not involve the inconvenience, cost, and risk of losing that would come into a for-cause eviction that they would have to do through a legal process. So I'm a little skeptical about the small landlord compensation unless it's very narrow, but also I'm wondering, when you envision this, are you envisioning a scenario where a small landlord applicant would be wholly exempt from paying, or is the idea that they would be partially subsidized in a certain situation, like it's a family member moving in?
So my proposal is that it would be very narrow and that no landlord would be exempt from paying DPA, but small landlords who demonstrate hardship, just like all tenants have to demonstrate hardship in order to qualify for certain monetary support, would have to come and apply for that for very narrow reasons. So we're talking about just in case of a no cause that is directly of like the landlord moving into the unit or a landlord's immediate family member moving into the unit, and they are, are below the unit threshold. I mean, we can talk more about that and build up some stuff around that to make sure that it's going to people that are truly in need. But I think that politically, the council will be, in my estimation, would want to see that as something that would help them come to a yes on this policy. And I do, I've been no cause evicted 3 separate times. So I have some lived experience with this. So I know the process, and I've seen according to CEDA's hotline data, we know that small landlords in Springfield are responsible for 90% of the no cause notices. So that is something that I am definitely aware of. And I think that we all need to think really carefully about this aspect of that.
Okay, and then just one quick follow-up. So I would just like to put on the record that I would be greatly concerned if paying for this out of the door tax meant that some of the other things the Housing Policy Board recommended, which would be the Housing Navigator, funding tenant supports, a tenant hotline, if some of those other things went by the wayside in order to create a small landlord compensation fund. So if you're thinking about this as funded by the door tax, are you thinking we should raise the door tax yet further for this purpose? Or are you thinking about that in relation to other existing things that are supposedly going to come out of this increased door tax? That's just something to think about going forward.
I definitely
Thank you.
prioritize the housing navigator and the tenant support. You know, I think that is first and foremost at the top of the mind.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. And Commissioner Trieger.
Thank you, Isaac. Thanks for the presentation. It's really interesting to me. My questions are more broadly. I assume Portland's the only city in Oregon that has this currently in place. Do we know, are there other cities taking this up? Is there any long-range hope or strategy for making this be something statewide? And then where the clearinghouse for the applications are, you know, lives at OHCS or somewhere that is less contextual to the community in which the landlords and tenants are operating, or anything else functionally about that you want to share about sort of long-range vision for this, or what we've learned from other states or cities doing similar programs?
I believe Portland is the only city in Oregon that has implemented this policy. I know Bend also considered it and instead made some tweaks to their notice requirements that came with a penalty if they were violated, instead of going with this route. And there's a couple, I think Bellingham and Washington, and I want to say Long Beach in California, but that might be wrong. Long Beach, they've also implemented very, very similar policies. And Kevin, I think you can speak to the statewide.
So there is a state work group sponsored by Representative Valderrama and Rep, maybe Senator Compost. I'm not sure which one she's at currently at this point in time, but she'll be Senator Compost or convening a work group. I think that passing this for the city of Eugene will give a greater appetite to seeing a statewide solution, as I'm sure that you are aware of things like the sick leave that you work so hard on. As Eugene and Portland goes, as does the rest of the state. So my hope is to pass this here and then follow up by passing it statewide.
Great, thanks. And who is the body or entity in Portland that reviews the applications the way you're proposing the Housing Policy Board would here for Eugene?
So Portland does not have a small landlord compensation fund.
Oh, okay.
And so this would be something that would be completely new. But I think that it might make our program a little bit better.
Great, thank you.
Great. And thank you, Ellen.